The colonel's hand caught her across the face with a crack that cut through the noise of the bar like a rifle shot. Her head snapped sideways. Beer sloshed off the table. 40 soldiers went quiet for half a second, then somebody laughed, and the rest of them followed like dogs picking up a scent. Colonel Raymond Vance stood over her with his chest out and his medals catching the neon, waiting for her to cry, or run, or beg. She did none of those things. She set her glass down on the bar top without spilling a drop. She turned her head back toward him, slow, the way a door swings when there's no wind to push it. A thin line of blood ran from the corner of her lip, and she didn't wipe it. She looked at Colonel Vance for 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds something in the room changed, though most of the men in it were too drunk or too stupid to feel it yet. Then she smiled. Just a little. "You hit like a man who's never been hit back," she said. "Now hold on. Hold on right there. I want you to freeze that picture in your head. The big man with the silver eagles on his collar and the rack of ribbons on his chest. The woman on the stool with blood on her lip and a smile she's got no business smiling. 40 soldiers laughing in a roadhouse off Route 9, a half-mile outside the gate at Fort Carson on a Friday night in October. That colonel, his name is Raymond Vance. He thinks he just put a woman in her place. He thinks the story's over. He thinks he's the most dangerous man in that bar. He is wrong about every single part of that. My name is Hargrove. Folks call me Gunny. 27 years in the United States Marine Corps, and 14 of those years I spent running the Scout Sniper School down at Quantico, Virginia. I trained 800 shooters in my time. 41 of them were women. And I'll tell you something I don't say often. I didn't train this one. Different service. Different community. The kind of work most folks aren't cleared to know exists. But I trained the man who trained her. His name was Master Chief Daniel Okafor, Navy, 22 years in the teams, and he told me about her over 3 bourbons at a bar in Virginia Beach back in 2018. He told me her name the way a man does when he wants to make sure you don't forget it. Her name is Senior Chief Petty Officer Diane Reyes, United States Navy, retired. And Colonel Raymond Vance has got about 90 seconds left before his entire life starts coming apart at the seams. He just doesn't know it yet. Sit down, friend. Pour yourself something. Let me tell you who she is. The bar was called the Ironwood. One of those low cinder block places with a tin roof and a gravel lot, the kind that grows up around every army post in this country like moss on the north side of a tree. Neon in the windows. A Budweiser sign older than half the men drinking under it. A flag on the wall that had gone gray from cigarette smoke back when you could still smoke indoors, and nobody'd ever taken it down. Pool tables in the back. A jukebox that hadn't been updated since the second Bush administration. Diane Reyes had been coming there for 3 weeks. Always alone. Always the same stool at the far end of the bar, the one tucked into the corner where the wood met the wall, the seat that let her keep her back to something solid and her eyes on the door. She didn't pick that seat by accident. 19 years in the work she'd done, you don't sit any other way. You couldn't if you tried. The body learns things the mind stops asking about. She'd order 1 bourbon neat. She'd drink it slow over the better part of an hour. Then she'd pay in cash, leave a fair tip, and walk out to a gray pickup truck that was 10 years old and ran like the day it rolled off the line. The bartender was a man named Earl, 60-some years old, Vietnam tattoo gone blue and shapeless on his forearm. He'd figured her for a vet by the second night. Not from anything she said. She'd barely said 10 words a visit, but from how she carried herself. The economy of her movements. The way her eyes swept the room every time the door opened, fast and total, then went back to her glass like nothing had happened. Earl had seen it before. He'd seen it in the mirror a long time ago. He never asked. That was part of why she kept coming back. The Ironwood was the one place in that whole town where nobody asked her anything. Now here's what most folks miss about a woman like Diane Reyes, and I want you to understand it before we go any further, because the whole story turns on it. She wasn't there to be left alone because she was cold. She was there because she was trying to come back from somewhere. 8 months before this night, Diane had walked out of a place I'm not going to name, in a country I'm not going to name, after an operation that cost the lives of 2 men she'd have died for and saved the lives of 9 she'd never met. She came home with all her fingers and all her limbs and a head full of things that don't let a person sleep. The Navy gave her a medal she couldn't tell anybody about. Then it gave her a discharge. Then it gave her a phone number for a counselor in Denver and a pat on the back and goodbye. So she found a quiet bar with a corner stool, and she sat there 3 nights a week trying to remember how to be a person who isn't waiting to be killed. That's a hard thing to relearn, friend. Harder than most folks who've never had to do it could ever know. She wasn't picking a fight. She was about as far from picking a fight as a human being can get. Which brings us to Colonel Raymond Vance. Vance was Army. Big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of frame that fills a doorway and makes sure you notice him filling it. 51 years old. A full colonel with a brigade command and a wall of plaques in an office on post. He had the ribbons. He had the airborne wings and the Ranger tab and the right schools on his record. On paper, Raymond Vance was an impressive soldier. Here's the thing the paper didn't say. In 30 years of service, Raymond Vance had never once been shot at. Not once. He'd built an entire career on staffs and schools, and the kind of postings where the most dangerous thing in the building is the coffee. He'd been to Iraq exactly 1 time, for 11 months, working logistics out of a base the size of a small city, 200 miles from anyone who wanted to hurt him. He came home with a deployment patch and a tan, and a way of talking that made men who'd never been there believe he'd seen the elephant. Our boy Vance had the kind of confidence that looks like a fence at 50 yards. Tall, straight, painted white, real impressive. You get up close, you see it's 3 rotten boards held together with baling wire and a prayer. And like a lot of men of that particular type, Colonel Vance had spent so many years being the biggest thing in every room he walked into that he'd forgotten rooms can have things in them he can't see. That Friday night, he came into the Ironwood with 4 officers from his brigade, 2 majors and a couple of captains, all of them younger, all of them is. They came in loud. They came in already 3 drinks deep from the officers' club, looking to keep the night going somewhere. The rules were looser. Vance walked through that bar like he owned the deed to it. He clapped men on the shoulder he'd never met. He told the captains where to sit. He ordered a round in a voice meant to be heard by the whole room. And somewhere in the first 20 minutes, his eyes landed on a woman sitting alone in the corner, nursing a bourbon, minding her own business and bothering nobody at all. He should have kept walking. He had a whole bar to be loud in. But men like Raymond Vance, they've got an instinct for the one person in the room who isn't looking at them. It bothers them at a level they can't even name. A woman who doesn't notice him is a problem his whole personality is built to solve. So he walked over. "You drinking alone, sweetheart?" Vance leaned a hand on the bar beside her, close, crowding into the space around that corner stool. "That's a damn shame. Pretty thing like you." Diane didn't look up from her glass. "I'm fine, thank you." "She's fine," Vance said over his shoulder, and the captains laughed on cue, the way men laugh at a colonel's jokes when their next evaluation is sitting on his desk. He turned back to her. "What's your name, honey?" "I'm just here for a drink. I don't want any trouble." Now watch this part. Because she said the truest thing a person can say, and he heard the opposite of it. She said, "I don't want any trouble." And what landed in Raymond Vance's ears was, "Here is a woman who's afraid of me." To a man like that, fear is the same as an invitation. It always has been. It's the only language he's ever been fluent in. "I'm a colonel in the United States Army," Vance said, and his voice climbed up loud enough that the men at the pool tables turned to look. "You know what that means? That means when I ask a lady her name, she answers me." "That's just manners. Were you not raised with manners?" Earl the bartender set down the glass he was drying. "Colonel," he said, careful, "she's not bothering anybody. Why don't I get you and your boys around on the house? Set you up at the good table back there." "Did I ask you, old man?" Vance didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes on Diane. "Stay out of it." That's worth sitting with for a second. An army colonel in a public bar full of witnesses telling a 60-year-old combat veteran to shut his mouth, and doing it without a flicker of doubt that he had the right. That's not a man who'd had a bad night. That's a man who'd been getting away with it his whole life and had stopped being able to imagine a world where he wouldn't. He turned back to Diane Reyes. And he made his second mistake of the evening. The first had been walking over. The second was reaching out and putting his hand on her shoulder. I want to tell you what 19 years of the work she did had built into Diane Reyes by that point in her life. When a hand closed on her shoulder from behind or the side, unannounced, her body had 3 responses already loaded and ready before her conscious mind ever got a vote. She had spent the better part of 2 decades training every one of those responses into reflex, the way you train a hammer to find a nail. In the places she worked, an unexpected hand on your body was very often the last warning you were ever going to get. She did not use any of those 3 responses. And friend, I want you to understand that took more strength, more discipline, more pure command of herself than anything that big loud colonel had done in 30 years of wearing the uniform. She let his hand sit there. She turned her head, slow, and she looked at it. Then she looked up at his face. "Take your hand off me," she said. Quiet. Even. No heat in it at all. "I'm asking you nice. That's the only time I'm going to ask nice." And Colonel Raymond Vance, God help him, Colonel Vance laughed. He laughed, and he looked back at his captains while he did it, because the laugh wasn't really for her. It was a performance, and they were the audience, and a man like Vance never does anything that doesn't have an audience in mind. "Or what?" he said. "You'll ask me mean?" "Colonel," Earl's voice had gone flat and hard. He'd come down to that end of the bar, both hands on the wood. "Last time. Walk away. And I told you to stay out of it." Vance's hand was still on her shoulder. His fingers tightened, just enough to make it a thing, just enough to show the room he could. "I don't know who you think you are, sweetheart, sitting in the corner like you're too good to talk to a colonel. But out here, off your little reservation or wherever you crawled out of, you're nobody. You hear me? You're nobody." And that's when he hit her. It wasn't even a real strike. That's the part one wants you to hold on to. Raymond Vance had never thrown a punch that mattered in his entire life. What he did was backhand her across the face, the way a man does when he's not trying to hurt somebody so much as he's trying to mark them. To put a hand on them in front of everybody. To say you belong to me to do with as I please, and there's not a soul in this room who'll stop me. The crack of it carried. Her head went sideways. Blood at the corner of her mouth. And the bar laughed. "Now I've got to stop here, because I want to be honest with you about something. When Daniel Okafor told me this story, he stopped at this exact part, and he didn't say anything for a long minute. We just sat there with our bourbons, because the laugh is the worst part, not the hit, the laugh. 40 men in that room. Soldiers, most of them. Men who'd sworn an oath that's supposed to mean you stand between the strong and the weak, not behind them clapping. And a full colonel backhands a woman half his size who's done nothing but ask to be left alone, and the room laughs because the colonel laughed first, and that's how it works in places run by men like Vance. The fear comes dressed up as a good time. Everybody laughs, so nobody has to be the one who didn't. Sit with that for a second. Then sit with this. Of those 40 men, exactly one of them wasn't laughing. And he was about to be the only one in the building who understood what everybody else was about to find out. Diane Reyes set her glass down. She didn't slam it. She set it down gentle, the way you set down something you don't want to spill. She turned her head back toward Colonel Vance, slow, and the blood ran down off her lip and dropped onto the bar, one drop, dark in the neon light. She smiled, and she said the thing I told you at the start. "You hit like a man who's never been hit back." Now here's what most folks miss, friend, and it's the most important thing in this whole story, so I'm going to say it plain. Diane Reyes could have killed Raymond Vance. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I don't mean she could have whipped him in a fight. I mean that from the stool she was sitting on, in the position his body was in, leaning over her with his weight forward and his hand on her shoulder and his throat and his knee and a dozen other things hanging out there exposed like fruit on a low branch. A woman with her training had probably 6 different ways to put that man on the floor permanently. And most of them would have taken less than 2 seconds. She didn't use any of them. And I need you to understand why. Because if you don't understand why, you don't understand her. And if you don't understand her, this whole story is just a bar fight. And it is so much more than a bar fight. She didn't hit him because hitting him was what he wanted. Not consciously. Vance didn't have a death wish. But a man like that, his whole power runs on one thing, the belief that he's the most dangerous thing in the room. If she put him on the floor, even if she'd done it clean and walked out free, she'd have been playing his game on his board. She'd have proven that the way you win is the way he'd always believed, with your hands, with your size, with violence. She'd have become, for 2 seconds, the same kind of thing he was. She didn't want to be that. 8 months out from the worst night of her life, sitting in a corner bar trying to learn how to be a person again. The very last thing in the world Diane Reyes wanted to be was a person who solves things by hurting people. She'd done enough of that to last her 10 lifetimes. She knew exactly what it cost and exactly what it bought, and she wasn't buying any more. So she did something harder. She did the hardest thing there is. She sat still, with blood on her lip, in a room full of laughing men, and she let the moment hang there, and she trusted that the truth of what had just happened was bigger than the lie the Colonel was telling about it. She bet everything on the idea that somewhere in that room, in that whole sorry laughing room, there was one person who'd seen what really happened. That, friend, is the kind of courage they don't give medals for. They don't even have a name for it. I've spent my whole life around brave people, and I've only seen it a handful of times. It's the courage to not fight when fighting is right there and easy and would feel so good. It's the courage to be still. And her bet paid off. Because in the back corner of the Ironwood, at a little two-top table near the dead jukebox, an old man set down his beer and pushed back his chair. His name was Walter Briggs, 73 years old. Sun-spotted hands, a VFW kept gone soft with years, the kind of old man you walk past in a bar 100 times and never look at twice. He'd been sitting there the whole time, alone, the way he was most nights. Nobody paid him any mind. Old men in VFW caps are furniture in a place like that. But Walter Briggs had spent 26 years in the United States Navy, and the last 14 of those years he'd spent in the same community Diane Reyes came up in. The work that doesn't have a name. The teams behind the teams. Walter Briggs had retired before Diane ever enlisted. They'd never served together. They'd never met. But he knew her face. He knew it the way you know a face from a photograph passed hand to hand in a quiet room, the way you know the name of somebody who did a thing that gets talked about in low voices by the few men cleared to talk about it at all. He'd recognized her the first night she walked into the Ironwood 3 weeks back. And being the man he was, he'd never said a word. He'd just nodded to her once, the way old operators nod to young ones, and let her have her corner and her bourbon and her piece. Now he stood up, and the bar didn't notice, not at first, because who notices an old man standing up? He walked across the floor, slow, with a hitch in his left hip, and he didn't stop until he was standing right next to Colonel Raymond Vance. He had to tilt his head up to look at him. He came up to about the colonel's collarbone. "Son," Walter Briggs said. His voice wasn't loud, but the bar had started to go quiet on its own by then, the laughter trailing off, men sensing something they couldn't name. "I'm going to do you the biggest favor anybody's done you in 20 years. And you're too damn dumb to know it, but I'm going to do it anyway." Vance looked down at him and sneered. "Go sit down, Gramps, before you hurt yourself." "You need to apologize to this woman," Walter said, like the colonel hadn't spoken at all. "And you need to get in your car, and you need to drive back through that gate, and you need to pray to whatever God you've got that she decides to let this go. Because right now, son, your entire life is sitting on that bar stool deciding whether it likes you. And it's leaning no." "You know what?" Vance's face had gone red. "A colonel does not get talked to like this. Not by a woman in a corner, and sure as hell not by some old man in a VFW cap. And the fact that it was happening twice in 5 minutes had short-circuited something in him. "I don't know what kind of senile nonsense you're." Do you know who she is? Walter said. And something in the way he said it, quiet and certain and a little bit sad, finally cut through. Vance stopped. The captains had gone still. Earl behind the bar had gone still. The whole Ironwood had gone still. 40 men holding 40 breaths, and only 2 people in the entire place looked calm. The old man in the cap, and the woman on the stool. "No," Vance said, and for the first time all night, just barely, there was something underneath his voice that wasn't certainty. "Who is she?" Walter Briggs looked at Diane. And Diane, who hadn't said a word since you hit like a man who's never been hit back, gave the old sailor the smallest shake of her head. Don't. She didn't want her name in that room. She'd spent 19 years keeping it out of rooms. Walter respected that. He'd carried the same weight his whole life. He knew what she was asking. So he didn't say her name. He just turned back to Vance, and he gave him the only piece of it he could. "She's the reason," Walter said slowly, "that 9 families in this country still have a son, and 2 families don't. And she carries both of those things every single day, which is more weight than you have picked up in your entire soft life, Colonel." "You put your hand on her." He shook his head. "Lord, you put your hand on her." "Now I want to take you out of that bar for just a minute, friend, because there's something you need to know, and this is as good a place as any to tell you." When Daniel Okafor told me about Diane Reyes, the bar story wasn't the story he was telling. He mentioned it at the end, almost as a footnote, after 3 bourbons and 2 hours of talking about the thing she'd actually done overseas. The thing I can't tell you, the thing that's still locked up in a building in Virginia and won't see daylight in your lifetime or mine. The bar was the small thing, the afterthought. But I've thought about that bar 1,000 times since. More than the operation, if I'm honest. Because the operation, I understand. I know what makes a person able to do what she did over there. It's training, and it's nerve, and it's a kind of cold, clear thing in the head that some people are born with and most aren't. But the bar I had to think about for a long time. Because in that bar, she wasn't a SEAL. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't on a mission with a team at her back and a country's worth of resources behind her. She was just a tired woman on a stool, 8 months out from the worst thing that ever happened to her, getting backhanded by a coward in front of a laughing crowd, with every reason in the world and every ability in her body to make it stop the fast and bloody way. And she chose to be still. She chose to bet on the decency of one stranger in a room of 40. She chose to win the kind of way you can live with at 3 in the morning when the nightmares come. That's not training, friend. They can't train that into you. That's just who somebody already is. Hell of a thing. Now, back to the Ironwood. Walter Briggs hadn't said her name, but he'd said enough. 9 families still have a son. 2 don't. That kind of sentence carries weight in a room full of soldiers, even drunk ones, even Vance's own captains. It's the kind of math everybody in that uniform understands in their bones, whether they've done the work themselves or not. You don't put a number like that on a person who isn't the real thing. And you could see it move through the room. Slow, the way cold moves through water. One of the captains, a young man named Doyle, had stopped smiling a while back. He was looking at Diane now with a different set of eyes. He'd done 2 tours himself, real ones, and somewhere under the beer he'd started to do the arithmetic. A woman sitting alone in a corner, picking the seat with her back to the wall, not flinching at a backhand that would have put most folks on the floor. The old man crossing the room to stand between her and a colonel, the way she'd never once reached for her own defense, because she didn't need to. Captain Doyle set his beer down. "Sir," he said. Quiet. "Sir, maybe we should go." "Sit down, Doyle." But Vance's voice had lost something. The certainty had a crack in it now, thin as a hairline, but there. He looked at Diane Reyes again, and for the first time all night, he really looked at her. Not at a woman he could push around. At a person. And what he saw scared him, because it was the one thing a man like Vance can never abide seeing in somebody he's decided is beneath him. He saw that she wasn't afraid of him. She never had been. Not for 1 second of the whole encounter. The fear he thought he saw, the fear that felt to him like an invitation, it had never been there at all. He'd made it up. He'd needed it to be there, so he'd put it there himself, the way men like him always do. What was actually there, sitting on that stool, looking back at him with blood drying on her lip, was something he had no name for and no defense against. It was the calm of a person who has already been to the worst place there is and come back, and who knows, all the way down, that there is nothing a soft man in a bar could ever do to her that comes within 1,000 miles of what she's already survived. "Colonel," Diane said. First time she'd spoken in a while. Her voice was still even. Still quiet. "Your captain's right. You should go. Right now, while going still the whole price." Now here's where I have to tell you what most folks get wrong about a moment like this. They think the story's about the slap. They think it's building to her getting even. They're waiting, the whole time, for the part where she stands up and breaks his arm, and the bar cheers, and the colonel cries, and everybody gets what's coming to them. That's the story they've seen 100 times. That's the story Vance himself was braced for, somewhere in the back of his head, because it's the only kind of ending a man like him can imagine, somebody bigger and meaner doing to him what he does to everybody else. But that's not who Diane Reyes was, and it's not how this ends. She didn't want to hurt him. She'd told him the truth twice now. "I don't want any trouble." She meant it. What she wanted was for a stupid, dangerous man to walk out the door before his own stupidity cost him everything, because even then, even with her lips split open, some part of Diane Reyes was still trying to give Raymond Vance a mercy he had done nothing on God's earth to deserve. That's the part that gets me, friend. That's the part one think about. She gave him 3 chances to walk. 3. After he hit her, she was still handing him the door. He didn't take it. Of course he didn't take it. Men like Vance never take the door. The door, to them, is the same as losing, and they'd burn the whole house down around themselves before they'd be seen walking out a door a woman pointed them to. "You're threatening me?" Vance's voice came back up, too loud, the bluster rushing back in to cover the crack. "You hear this? She's threatening a United States Army colonel." In front of witnesses. He turned to the room, arms wide, playing to a crowd that wasn't laughing anymore. "I want everybody here to remember." "They'll remember," Walter Briggs said. "Don't you worry about that, Colonel. Every man in this room is going to remember tonight for the rest of his life. Just not the way you think." And that's when Vance grabbed her again. This time it wasn't a slap. This time he reached down and took a fistful of her jacket at the collar, two-handed, to haul her up off that stool, to put her on her feet so he could be standing over her properly, so the whole room could see him do it. It was the move of a man who's decided that the only way back to being the biggest thing in the room is to go bigger, louder, more physical, because the talking has stopped working and his hands are the only argument he has left. He got one good pull in, got her halfway up off the stool. And then Diane Reyes finally moved. I want to be careful here, because I want you to understand exactly what she did and exactly what she didn't do. She didn't break him. She had every right to. A man had laid hands on her twice and was in the middle of dragging her off a chair, and by any law in this country and any code in that uniform, she'd have been clean to put him through the floor. Nobody would have blamed her. Half that room would have helped. She didn't do that. What she did was this. As he pulled her up, she went with it, used his own pull, came up off that stool fast and inside his reach, and her hands found his wrists, not to twist them, not to break them, just to hold them, and she stepped in close, chest to chest with a man who had 80 pounds on her, and she locked him up. Quiet, efficient, the way you'd close a door. He couldn't pull. He couldn't push. Suddenly, the big, strong colonel was just standing there, frozen, with his hands trapped against a woman half his size, who wasn't even straining, and he could not for the life of him understand why he couldn't move. She put her mouth close to his ear, and she said something only he could hear. Walter Briggs saw her say it. The captain saw her say it. Nobody in that bar heard what it was. Daniel Okafor didn't know either. Diane never told him, and he never asked. So I can't tell you her exact words, friend, and I won't make some up, because making up her words is the one thing I won't do in any of these stories. But I can tell you what happened to Raymond Vance's face while she said it. All the red went out of it. All the bluster, all the colonel, all the 30 years of being the biggest thing in every room. It drained out of his face in about 4 seconds, and what was left underneath was just a frightened man who had finally, at 51 years old, met something he could not bully, and could not out-yell, and could not survive by being loud. Whatever she said into his ear, it wasn't a threat. I'd put money on that. A man like Vance, you don't break with a threat. Threats are a language he speaks. She told him a truth. That's my best guess, and it's only a guess. She told him some quiet true thing about what he was, and what was about to happen to him, and she said it without heat, and without mercy, and without any way for him to argue with it, and it landed in him like a round from a cold bore at 100 yards. Then she let go of his wrists, stepped back, sat down on her stool, picked up her bourbon, and turned back to the bar like he wasn't there anymore. That, friend, is the most frightening thing one human being can do to another. Not hurt them, dismiss them. She looked at a man who'd built his whole self around being impossible to ignore, and she ignored him. Vance stood there for a second with his trapped hands suddenly free and nothing to do with them. His mouth worked. Nothing came out. Then he turned, fast, the way a man turns when he's about to either cry or be sick and doesn't want anybody to see which, and he walked out of the ironwood and into the gravel lot and the October dark, and his captains went after him, all but one. Captain Doyle stayed behind a minute. He walked down to the corner of the bar, and he stopped a respectful distance from Diane Reyes, and he came to something close to attention, this young man in civilian clothes in a roadhouse, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner." Diane looked at him, and the hardness she'd had for Vance wasn't there for this one. She just nodded slow. "You said it when it counted," she told him. "That's more than most. Go on. Look after your colonel. He's going to have a rough few weeks." Now hold on, because I told you at the top this was the part where his whole life starts coming apart, and I owe you the how of it. Here's what most folks miss. Diane Reyes never filed a thing. She never called the post. She never made a complaint, never hired a lawyer, never so much as mentioned Raymond Vance's name to a single soul in any official capacity. She finished her bourbon, left her tip, nodded to Earl and to old Walter Briggs, and drove her gray pickup home through the dark, and as far as she was concerned, that was the end of it. She'd given the man 3 chances to walk and he hadn't, and the rest of it was no longer her problem. She didn't have to do a single thing, because in that bar, that night, there'd been 40 witnesses. And 40 witnesses, once the spell of the colonel's laughter is broken, have 40 mouths. That's worth sitting with for a second. A man like Vance survives on the silence of the rooms he bullies. Everybody laughs, everybody looks away, everybody decides it's not their business, and so he goes on, year after year, getting bigger and louder and more sure that the rules that catch other men will never catch him. He'd been getting away with it so long he'd forgotten it was getting away with anything at all. But the moment a 73-year-old sailor stood up and put a number on that woman, 9 families still have a son, and the moment she locked him up one-handed and made him walk out into the dark, the spell broke. And once it breaks, it doesn't go back together. 40 men who'd laughed went home that night not laughing. And some of them had wives. And some of them had a first sergeant they trusted. And one of them, Captain Doyle, had a conscience that wasn't going to let him sleep. It started, of all places, in a parking lot on Monday morning. Captain Doyle hadn't slept much that weekend. He'd done what most good men do with a thing that sits wrong in their gut. He tried to talk himself out of it. Not my business. Colonel had a bad night. Everybody's got a bad night. The woman's fine. She handled herself. Nothing came of it. He ran every excuse a decent man runs when the easy road and the right road part ways, and he can already tell the right road's going to cost him. But here's the thing about Doyle. He'd done 2 real tours. He'd had a sergeant once, back in his lieutenant days, who'd pulled him aside after Doyle let something slide that he shouldn't have, and that sergeant had said to him, "Sir, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept." Doyle had carried that line for 6 years. It wouldn't let him walk past this one. So Monday morning he went and found his battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel named Hutchins, and he asked for 10 minutes. And he told him exactly what he'd seen at the Ironwood. All of it. The slap. The laugh. The old man. The woman who handled a full colonel like he was a child and never raised a hand. He didn't dress it up, and he didn't soften it, and he didn't leave out the part where he himself had laughed at the start, because Doyle wasn't going to be a man who tells the truth selectively. Now Hutchins was in a hard spot, and I'll be honest with you about it. Vance was senior to him. Vance had a brigade. Vance had friends. The path of least resistance, the one that's killed 1,000 good investigations before they ever started, was for Hutchins to say thank you. Captain, I'll look into it, and then look into it real quiet and let it die. He didn't take that road either. And I want to give the man his due, because this story's got more than one person in it who did the harder thing. Hutchins took it to the Inspector General. Officially, on paper, he put his own name on it, knowing exactly what it might cost him to be the man who reported a colonel. Because Hutchins, too, had a number in his head. He'd done the same math everybody who heard the story did. A backhand in a bar is bad enough. A backhand to a woman who turned out to be what that old man said she was, that's the kind of thing that, once it's known, can't be unknown. And Hutchins didn't want to be the man who knew and sat on it. Here's what most folks don't understand about how a man like Vance actually falls. It's never the one thing. The slap in the bar by itself, a good lawyer, a friendly board, a quiet word in the right ear, and a man like Vance walks away from one bad night with a letter in his file he outlives in 2 years. One incident, no matter how ugly, is survivable for a man with rank and friends. But an investigation isn't a flashlight pointed at one night. It's a flashlight pointed at a man. And once they turned the light on Raymond Vance, the bar was the least of what it found. Because men like Vance are never doing it for the first time. The bar wasn't an aberration. It was just the one that happened in front of 40 witnesses, and an old seal, and a woman who didn't break. The IG started pulling threads, and the threads kept coming. A civilian employee in his brigade who'd put in a complaint 2 years back that got buried. A junior officer, a woman, who transferred out of his command in a hurry and never quite said why, and who, when somebody finally asked her gently and meant it, had a great deal to say. A pattern. The thing investigators live for, and the thing men like Vance can never survive, because the whole architecture of their life is built on each incident being separate, deniable, a one-off, a bad night. Lay them side by side, and they stop being bad nights. They become a man. Sit with that for a second, because it's the truest thing about how the world actually catches these people. It's almost never the one big dramatic reckoning. It's not the woman breaking his arm in the bar. It's a slow, patient, unglamorous accumulation of every quiet harm he ever did to somebody who didn't have 40 witnesses, all of it finally pulled out into the light because one night he picked the wrong woman and one captain couldn't sleep and one battalion commander decided the standard he walked past was the standard he'd have to live with. The bar didn't end Raymond Vance. The bar just turned on the light. It took 8 months. These things always do. The wheels grind slow. But they grind. By the following summer, Colonel Raymond Vance was relieved of his brigade command for cause. Those last 3 words mattered. For cause. They're the ones that follow a man the rest of his career. There was a board. The buried complaint came up. The junior officer who transferred out came and spoke, and this time somebody listened. The findings were what the findings were. Vance retired. Not at his rank. They took a step off it on the way out. The kind of thing that costs a man real money for the rest of his life, and, worse for a man like him, cost him the title. No more colonel. Just Mr. Vance now. The wall of plaques came down off the office wall and went into a box in a garage, which is where that kind of thing goes to die. And here's the part that I think Diane Reyes would have appreciated if she'd ever bothered to follow it, which she didn't. He was never charged over the bar. Not criminally. She never filed, remember? The slap itself, legally, mostly evaporated. No complaint, no victim pressing it, just witness statements about a thing nobody had taken to the police. The system didn't get Raymond Vance for what he did to her. It got him for who he was. The bar just made the right people look. Diane never knew any of it as it happened. She'd put it out of her mind that same night, driving home. It came to her later, secondhand, the way these things do. Walter Briggs heard it through the VFW grapevine, the Post being the kind of small town where command news travels fast, and one night at the Ironwood Munson, he leaned over to her corner stool and told her, quiet, that the colonel was gone. Relieved. Retired down a notch. The whole house of cards. Diane listened. She nodded. She took a sip of her bourbon. And all she said was, "I told him going was the whole price." That was it. No satisfaction in it. No gloating. She'd offered the man a door 3 times, and he'd refused it, and now he'd paid the larger price instead, and to Diane Reyes that wasn't a victory. It was just arithmetic. A thing that was always going to happen the moment he decided not to walk. Now I want to come off the story for a minute, because there's something personal I need to say, and this is where I'll say it. I've got a granddaughter. Her name's Maggie. She's 11 years old as I'm telling you this, all elbows and questions, and she's got a mean streak of stubborn in her that I recognize because it came down through me. She's the kind of kid who, when somebody tells her she can't, decides on the spot that she will, just to prove the point. I sit on my porch in the evenings these days, more than I used to, and I think about the world Maggie's walking into. And I'll tell you what scares me, friend, and it isn't the loud men. The loud men, the Van Cess of the world, big and red-faced and sure of themselves, I'm not worried about them. They announce themselves. You can see a Vance coming a mile off. He's the rotten fence painted white. Get up close, and the whole thing's baling wire. What I want for Maggie isn't that she learns to out-yell the Van Cess. It's that she learns what Diane Reyes knew, sitting on that stool with blood on her lip and 6 ways to end a man, and the wisdom not to use a single one of them. I want her to know that the strongest person in the room is almost never the loudest. That real strength is so quiet you can sit next to it in a corner bar for 3 weeks and never know it's there. That the measure of what you are isn't what you can do to people, it's what you can do and choose not to. I want her to know that you can be the most dangerous person in the building and still ask twice, please, leave me be. That asking nice isn't weakness. That offering a man the door 3 times after he's hit you isn't weakness either. It's a kind of strength most folks will never have the spine for, because it costs you the easy satisfaction and gives you nothing back but the ability to sleep at night. And I want her to know that when she sees it happen to somebody else, when she's one of 40 in a room and somebody's getting backhanded and everybody's laughing, I want her to be Walter Briggs. I want her to be the one who stands up. Or Captain Doyle, who couldn't sleep. The world doesn't turn on the Dianes alone, friend. It turns on the ones who stand up next to them. The old man who crosses the room. The young officer who walks into his commander's office on Monday morning knowing it might cost him. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept, and there's a whole bar full of people every single day deciding which standard they'll live with. That's the part one want Maggie to carry, not the slap, the standing up. So that's most of it, but there's a little more, and I want to leave you with it, because it's my favorite part, and Daniel Okafor saved it for last too, the night in Virginia Beach, and now I understand why. About a year after the bar, The thing Diane Reyes had actually done overseas. The operation, the one I can't tell you about, the one that's locked in a building in Virginia. A small piece of it came unclassified. Not the whole thing. Just enough. Enough that a handful of people who'd been on the other end of that night, the 9 families with sons who came home, learned a name they'd never been allowed to know. And one of those families did something about it. There was a young man, I'll call him Sergeant Kelly, because his real name doesn't belong in a story he didn't ask to be in, who'd been one of the 9. He'd been 23 years old on the worst night of his life, pinned down somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, certain he was going to die in a place his mother would never be told the name of. And he didn't die. He came home. He got married. He had a daughter of his own. And for years, he carried the thing that men in that situation carry, which is the knowledge that he was alive because of people he could never thank. That's a strange weight, friend. To owe your whole life, your wife, your daughter, every ordinary morning, to a person whose face you never saw and whose name you were never told. Most men in that spot just learn to live with it. It becomes a quiet ache they carry to the grave. When that sliver got unclassified, Kelly got a name. And Kelly was not a man who could leave a debt like that unspoken once he had a name to speak it to. It took him months to find her. Diane Reyes was not a person who wanted to be found. But the community's small, and the old hands look out for each other, and eventually word got passed through the right quiet channels, and one fall evening, about 2 years after the bar now, a knock came on the door of a small house with a gray pickup in the drive, out past the edge of a town I won't name. Diane opened the door, and there stood a young man she'd never seen before in her life, in civilian clothes, holding a little girl by the hand. The girl was maybe 4. She had a stuffed rabbit under one arm, and she was staring up at Diane with the open, fearless curiosity that only small children have. "Senior Chief Reyes?" the young man said. His voice wasn't steady. "You don't know me. My name's Kelly." I was. He stopped. Started again. I was at. And he named the place. The place. The one she didn't talk about and couldn't talk about, and tried not to think about at 3 in the morning when the 2 who didn't come home came to visit her. Diane Reyes, who had stood unflinching while a colonel backhanded her in front of 40 laughing men, who had locked up a man twice her size without breaking a sweat, who had walked out of the worst night imaginable and put one foot in front of the other for 2 years since. Diane Reyes put her hand on the doorframe to steady herself. "I wanted my daughter to meet you," Kelly said. The tears were just running down his face now, and he wasn't trying to stop them, and he wasn't ashamed of them. "She wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. I needed her to see your face. I needed her to know you're real. I've been telling her about you her whole life, and I didn't even have a name to call you." He crouched down next to the little girl. "Baby, this is the lady I told you about. This is the one who made sure Daddy came home." And the little girl, who didn't understand any of it, who only understood that her daddy was crying and that this quiet woman in the doorway was somehow the reason, the little girl let go of her father's hand, and she walked up the steps, and she held up the stuffed rabbit, and she offered it to Diane Reyes. The way small children do when they don't have words for a big feeling, and they just want to give you the most important thing they've got. Now here's what gets me, friend. Here's the whole thing right here. Diane Reyes got down on one knee on her own front porch, on a level with that little girl, and she didn't take the rabbit. She folded the child's hands back around it, gentle, both of her hands over those small ones. And she said, Walter Briggs heard this part later, from Kelly himself, who told it at the VFW with his voice breaking. She said, "You keep him, sweetheart. He's yours. You hold on to him real tight." And then she looked up at Kelly, this young father falling apart on her steps, and whatever was on her face in that moment, Kelly said he'd never forget it the rest of his days. Because it wasn't pride. It wasn't even quite happiness. It was something deeper and stranger than either. It was a woman seeing, for the first time in 2 years, with her own eyes, that the worst night of her life had been the reason for this. This porch, this father, this child with a rabbit. 2 didn't come home. She carried that. She'd carry it forever. It never got lighter. But here was one of the 9, in the flesh, with a daughter who had a daddy because of her. The 2 she lost were the price. This little girl was what the price had bought. I don't know that anything ever fully heals a person who's been where Diane Reyes had been. I've known a lot of folks who came back from the dark places, and I won't sit here and tell you a knock on the door fixes it. It doesn't. The nightmares don't stop because a child hands you a rabbit. That's not how it works, and I won't lie to you and say it is. But I'll tell you this. There are nights, and then there are nights. And some small number of them. If you're very lucky, and you've done something that mattered, you get one that goes in the other column. One you can take out at 3 in the morning, when the 2 who didn't come home come to visit, and set down next to them. Yes, and also this. Also a little girl with a rabbit. Also a father who couldn't stop crying. Also that. It doesn't cancel the dark. It just sits beside it. And sometimes, friend, sitting beside it is enough to get a person through to morning. So now you know why Daniel Okafor saved that part for last. And why I do too. Because I think people hear a story like the one I started with, the Colonel, the slap, the laughing bar, and they want it to be about revenge. They want the satisfying crunch of a bad man getting what's coming. And there's some of that here, sure. Vance fell. Vance deserved to fall. I won't pretend I shed a tear for Mr. Vance and his box of plaques in the garage. But that was never what the story was about. Diane Reyes didn't lift a finger to bring Vance down. She offered him the door 3 times, and he wouldn't take it, and the world took its own course without her help. She didn't need him to fall. She'd never needed anything from him at all. What the story's actually about is the difference between 2 kinds of strength, and which kind builds a life worth living. There's Vance's kind. Loud. Hungry for an audience. Built on what you can do to people smaller than you, and needing, always, somebody smaller to do it to. It looks impressive from across the room. It fills a doorway. And it's hollow all the way through. And it falls the moment one person refuses to be afraid, because fear was the only thing holding it up. And then there's Diane's kind. So quiet you'd sit next to it in a corner bar for 3 weeks and never know. It's got nothing to prove and nobody to perform for. It's measured not by what it does, but by what it could do and chooses not to. It can be the most dangerous thing in the building and still say twice, "Please, leave me be." It can take a coward's slap and offer him the door anyway. And the reason it can afford to be so gentle, friend, is that it's real. It doesn't need to prove itself, because it already knows exactly what it is. One of those kinds of strength ends up retired a rank short, with a box of plaques in a garage and a title nobody calls him by anymore. The other one ends up on her knees on her own front porch, folding a little girl's hands around a stuffed rabbit, finally getting to see, with her own 2 eyes, what all of it was for. I know which one I want my granddaughter Maggie to grow up to be. I know which one I'd want standing next to me in a bar full of laughing men. I know which one I'd want sitting beside me at 3 in the morning when the dark comes around, as it comes for all of us in the end. So that's the story of Senior Chief Petty Officer Diane Reyes, United States Navy, retired. The woman a colonel was foolish enough to backhand in a roadhouse off Route 9 on a Friday night in October, in front of 40 men and 1 old sailor, and a flag gone gray with smoke. He thought he was the most dangerous thing in that room. He never even came close. Keep your back to a solid wall, friend. Keep your eyes on the door. And when you see somebody getting hit and a whole room laughing, be the one who stands up. Be Walter Briggs. Be Captain Doyle, who couldn't sleep. That's the part of this you actually get to choose. The Dianes of the world are rare, and you might go your whole life and never be one. But anybody can stand up. Anybody.